one thing I've observed is that there are a lot of folks within the peak performance space and thought leadership space who've had challenges. Tim Ferriss, Stephen Kotler, of course, Dave Asprey, with mold, with Lyme disease, and with heavy metal poisoning, which sort of all seem to fall into this category. And I'm curious, is that because of potentially some predisposition to these issues due to trauma and limbic dysregulation or something like that? Or yeah, why is it that you tend to see these sorts of conditions clustered around certain types of people?
So I love that we're talking about this because I have some ideas and you probably haven't heard anywhere else. First of all, functional medicine or personalized medicine, precision medicine, the kind of medicine where you really try to find a why or a root cause, and you can name it anything you want. You just go deeper. It's a medical detective work. I think of it as actually quite simple. And it's these two buckets. It's toxic load and infectious burden. And really almost everything, and those two things contribute to inflammation and immune dysfunction and all the other things that we see. But if we think about inhibition or problems with peak performance, and someone who has a mold or a Lyme or any of these things, and I'll put them together, it's often this toxic load, which could include heavy metals, environmental toxins, pesticides, like me growing up in the farm, which I didn't really correlate verbally, but they are endocrine disruptors, which means they have hormone-like effects on the body. So for me, that was probably, I had a poor detox system, was exposed to these endocrine disruptors as a young child, maybe even in utero in my mother's womb. And then at 25 had a very early breast, which is a hormone-related cancer. So back to toxic load, absolutely affects all of us, and infectious burden, and how they fit together and why you're seeing so many people clustered is especially mold. Mold will, the toxins, so mold itself is the spores and stuff, they can't go into our bloodstream without transport, and we don't really inhale spores and get them into our blood. It just doesn't happen. They are in the environment. We could test them with air sampling and things, but the molds protect themselves with something called mycotoxins. So they secrete, so they can be behind the wall here. Say there's something right here. I don't see it. I don't feel it. It's invisible to me, but it's excreting its protective mechanism of mycotoxins. And these mycotoxins, like trichosethines, which are produced by the toxic black mold, are some of the most toxic chemicals in the world. They're being studied for chemical warfare, and they have immunotoxic, neurotoxic, kidney toxic, lung toxic, you name a system, and it's probably going to be affected by those toxins. They are literally 2.5 or less microns in diameter, sometimes 0.1 or less. So they can go straight into our lungs and diffuse from alveoli right into our blood with no transport. They can go into our nose and diffuse right into our brain through the cribriform plate. They can go into our sinuses. So they can literally go very easily into our body with no transport. So if we're exposed for periods of time, we accumulate these mycotoxins in our tissue. And how that relates to things like Lyme and tick-borne infections, which are also very common. I believe if we'd test 10,000 people on the street with no symptoms, we'd probably find half of them had been bitten by a tick and have Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, or some form of tick-borne infection, or multiple. But their immune system is robust. And so they're going from, maybe they're a bit 5 or 12 years old, and they're going through their life with no symptoms. They're fine. But all of a sudden they get into a water damaged building or a home that has some hidden mold. I've had a fridge that leaked one time. You might have a dishwasher you could have under a sink. It's tiny little things that don't seem like a big deal. But if that is goes into porous material like particle board or drywall, all of a sudden within a few months or a year, you have the mold growth because all they need is a water source. And then that mold will excrete these toxins that are toxic to your brain, nervous system, and immune system. It weakens our immune system. It's clearly in the literature as an immunosuppressive. There's one particular called mycophenolic acid. We measure it in people's urine all the time. That is used in a drug called Cellcept. That is the drug Cellcept. Cellcept is used for organ transplant. So like this is used in medicine as an immunosuppressive. It's known, it's not surprising. So then that immune suppression happens, and these people who are walking around fine, they had Lyme, but they weren't symptomatic because their immune system kept those infections in check. And then it pops up because their immune system can no longer keep it in check. And we see that with Lyme and co-infections, which are quite common, atypical bacteria like mycoplasma, and even things like viral reactivation, Epstein-Barr, herpetic viruses. So these things do kind of, like you mentioned, people, and they come together because we get into a weakened state from an exposure, and then all the infections start to come up.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.